So apartheid, the word literally means apartness. And it began as an ideology in South Africa, coincidentally in 1948 when Israel was founded. And the theory that the face that they put on it is that the races should have separate but equal development. And so this was a settler colonial regime in South Africa. And so as we know from segregation in schools in the United States, separate but equal is neither. Mm-hmm. So there were a number of laws that underlay this philosophy that kept things in place. Number one was that the Black native population of South Africa was considered to be citizens of what they called homelands or Bantustans. And these were these tiny little enclaves of not very usable land that were far from the urban centers and far from the areas of economic development. And many people were displaced to these lands and told, this is what you're a citizen of. You can't be in these other parts because you're not a citizen of these other parts of South Africa. So if you looked at a map of apartheid South Africa, you'd see these tiny little enclaves all over of these Bantustans. So the first pillar was displacement and land grabbing. And the second pillar was control of movement. And so for Black South Africans to move around in the white areas, which they had to because that was where the only jobs were, they had to have certain permits and they were only allowed to be in this place or that place. And so these were the famous pass laws in South Africa. And if you were stopped and didn't have your pass, or you presented it but it wasn't specific for the exact place where you were, you could get arrested and taken to their jails where you would no doubt be tortured. They were not pleasant places. So that's the third pillar, was just this massive militarized repression of the Black population. So those three pillars though, displacement, control of movement, and severe repression. If you look at Israel, it's just a textbook case. If you look at a current map of Israel and the occupied territories, you'll see that the occupied territories are broken up into these tiny little enclaves that are separated by Israeli-controlled territory, by settlements, by roads that only Israeli citizens can drive on. So Palestinians cannot move even freely about in these areas. They're just all these tiny little separate dots. It's not and would never be a viable country. And people who talk about a two-state solution have obviously never looked at this map. There's no state there. There's a bunch of little Bantustans. And the control of movement in these areas, Israel has military checkpoints all through these areas. So for movement, just if you want to go from one Palestinian village to another, you frequently will have to go through an Israeli checkpoint in order to do that. And they have this physical wall that they've built. They call it the separation barrier. The Palestinians call it the apartheid wall. And in the urban areas, it's huge, 30-foot high concrete barrier. And there are places where it goes between a Palestinian village and their agricultural lands. There's a place that I've seen where it goes right through the middle of a playground next to a school. It goes right through the middle of Al-Quds University in Jerusalem. So for Palestinians to try and move around and live in these areas is very difficult. In Bethlehem, Bethlehem is to Jerusalem like Brooklyn is to Manhattan, except there's not even a river. But there are so many barriers to travel. So it's a 10-minute car trip if you can go on one of those Israeli-only roads. But if you are a Palestinian and you have to travel on the Palestinian roads, you have to go through checkpoints and around this and around the wall and through this place where you can get, it's an hour and a half to get to the neighboring, they're practically contiguous. And then the third pillar were these pass laws. And so again, Palestinians living in the occupied territories, they don't have Israeli citizenship, they don't have Israeli ID, so they can't travel inside Israeli-controlled areas. They can't travel freely because they haven't got the proper ID. Now, there are some people who live in East Jerusalem, which East Jerusalem was occupied in 1967, was taken over by the Israelis. And so they set up a special system whereby some Palestinians living there have what are called Jerusalem IDs. And this gives them certain privileges and rights, that they can travel around certain areas of Jerusalem, that they have certain municipal services and so on. But what Israel has been doing in trying to annex more and more of Jerusalem and Judaize it is what they do. They want to change the demographic balance so that it becomes more Jewish and less Palestinian. So there are so many barriers, even just within East Jerusalem. If you look at the path of the wall, it's like a snake with little branches. So people living in certain areas of Jerusalem find that they can no longer get to their grocery store or their dentist or their job. So then they start going to a grocery store, dentist, or job that is more facing toward the east, because they can get to that. And then the Israeli authorities say, well, see, life in this area is not really centered on Jerusalem anymore, so you're not going to have a Jerusalem ID anymore. And they take it away. So I think those three pillars are just very clear examples of how Israel has replicated the system that apartheid was in South Africa.